Three Religious Rebels, Part 3, Stephen, Chapter 1. It had rained steadily all morning. Stephen had been dimly conscious of the tinkle of the water as it trickled from an end gable and struck the pebbles of the path beneath. When it gradually quieted and finally stopped, he became distracted. The silence was much more disturbing than the noise had been. He turned and looked out the window. On the far fringe of the black heavens, he found a silver-gray band which widened as he watched, for the somber clouds were scudding to the east. Stephen was caught by the strength and symmetry of the trees, as they stood silhouetted against the dark sky. Immediately below him he saw that the yellow flowers shone more brilliantly than they ever did under the summer sun. Strange, he mused aloud. I never noted that before. Darkness brings out beauty. After the cleansing rain, and in the shade of the hurrying black storm clouds, the garden was showing tints and tones that it hid when the sky was brilliant. The green of grass and leaf seemed softer, livelier, more glowing. The reds were warmer, even the purple that fringed the curved petals of the fleurs de lis was richer and more royal. As he turned back to his writing, Stephen wondered if souls too were not seen best in shadow. Picking up his stylus, he poised it in midair and focused his eyes on it. He thought of Robert, the old giant of Malem. Unquestionably, the statement was true of him. The shadowy background of trouble silhouetted his gigantic character and edged the mighty virtues of his soul. Stephen again bent over his desk and was about to continue his writing when the squishy clop-clop of a slow-footed horse came to him from the road beyond his window. He looked and saw a black-cowled rider whose clothes sagged clammily and told of long hours in the rain. Stephen could only see the man swaying back, but as the horse and rider rounded the curve of the yard, he thought, whoever he is a tired man. Not very long after, there came a tap on the abbot's door. Who could this be at such an hour, he wondered. He opened the door in puzzlement, but recognition and pleasure immediately took its place. Before the lay brother who stood there could say a word, Stephen strode past him, threw his arms around the black-robed stranger, kissed him on both cheeks, and cried delightedly, "Peter! Peter! Peter!" "Be careful, Reverend Father," protested the enfolded monk. "I'm wet." "You're Peter!" cried the abbot laughingly as he drew him into his room and closed the door. The good lay brother, who was left on the other side of that door, shook his head in puzzlement over the strange ways of this Englishman who was his abbot. Usually dignified and calm, he was now more excited and demonstrative than a Frenchman, and toward a black Benedictine at that. No, there was no accounting for the ways of these foreigners, he thought, as he made his way back to the stables. 20 minutes later, the robes of the black Benedictine were hanging by a fire to dry, while the black Benedictine himself stood before Stephen, tugging at the folds of the white cowl they had lent him, and laughing at the thought of what the grand abbot would say if he could see his brave Cluniac at the moment. "Now you look right," said Stephen. "White suits you admirably. You should wear it always." As Peter smiled, the abbot went on. "While you were changing, Peter, I did some counting. I'm sure my figures are correct, and yet I can't believe the result. Can it be 32 years since we parted?" "Almost to the day," agreed Peter, as he took the chair Stephen had drawn up for him. "Over 3 decades of years have passed since you went your way and I went mine. And a rainstorm had to bring us together again. Had the heavens not burst asunder the way they did, I would have had to continue on to Cluny and missed the opportunity of seeing whether my quondam fellow pilgrim is as bad as people say he is. You look human, In fact, you don't look so very different from the merry young Englishman I parted from after that blessed journey to Rome." Stephen had been studying his friend as he talked. He saw what time had done to the face of the boy he had met in Burgundy that far-off day 32 years ago. Stephen had been troubled that day and lonely. Paris and its years of study lay behind him. They had been the culmination of a life devoted to learning. As a boy, he had been sent to the Benedictines at Sherborne, in England. When he finished their course of studies, he had crossed the seas to the Isle of Saints and Scholars and frequented its celebrated schools, only to end where most scholars of the day ended, at Paris. But there he had grown restless. His life seemed empty. This quest for knowledge seemed vain. He suddenly decided to quest after truth. He began by donning the pilgrim's cloak and setting his face toward Rome. He had been on the road just long enough to be desperately lonely when, passing through Burgundy, he met an attractive youth of his own age, of good education and almost his own temperament. He too was on his way to Rome, a pilgrim. Together they made the journey. That it had not been an easy one was evident from their laughing recollections of the difficult snow-covered passes of the Alps. The night they got lost and frozen in the depths of a forest. The dangerous-looking strangers who had joined them but had not robbed them. The hunger they had known before they met the warm-hearted, open-handed, ever-smiling Italians of Lombardy. "And we separated in the woods of Moulins," said Peter in conclusion. That had been their parting. For on the way back, when they came to Burgundy, Peter had pushed on to Cluny, while Stephen, attracted by what he had heard of the holiness of Robert and his rebels, turned aside to join the aging giant and his handful of ex-hermits. "They tell me that old men sigh for what might have been," said Stephen. "And while we are not exactly old, we are not too young to take a quick glance at what could have been. Tell me, have you ever regretted not having taken the turn I took that day in the woods?" Peter looked at his old friend. He decided he could be as open as ever. "You're the man who should sigh for what might have been," he said. "I can't tell you the number of times I've thought how perfectly Cluny would have suited you, and how perfectly you would have suited Cluny. How often, when I'd be among the manuscripts, did I literally ache for you down among the carrots and turnips at Moulins. In all those 30-odd years, Stephen, the only moment that was not filled with regret for you was the moment I heard of your recension of the Bible. Up to that time, I could only see the burial of your talents, and I used to wonder just what the master of the house would say when he made his reckoning." Stephen smiled. "You sound just like the little imp who used to visit me daily during my first few years at Moulins. He used to say just what you've been saying." Believe me, he could quote scripture most exactly. He used to frighten me with that parable of the talents. Do you know that little imp's name? No. "Satan," said Stephen with a laugh. "Let me tell you, Peter, he tried me often with that temptation, couched almost in identical words that you used." "Was it a temptation?" asked Peter with a meaningful look. Stephen studied his friend for a moment. He found him most seriously and even anxious. "I take it that you do not approve of Citeaux," he said. "Not for you, Stephen. Even though you are its abbot, you won't mind my speaking honestly. I think it was our mutual honesty that linked us so closely the year we journeyed to Rome." "Stephen, Stephen," said Peter sadly, "how is God glorified by this entombing of your brilliance? Not 10 men on the continent had your native intellectual endowment. I told you 30 years ago that you belonged in Cluny. That conviction has been deepened with the years, both by what I know of that monastery and what I have heard of this." "What do you know of this, Peter?" asked Stephen. He was sorry the conversation had taken this turn so early. He feared that it would ultimately reach this pass, but he hoped to forestall it. However, he would face the issue now. If Peter was the Peter of old, it was the only way to act. "What do I know of this place?" repeated Peter. "What everybody knows, that it is beyond nature, that it is asking for more than a man can give and more than God demands. In short, that it is fanaticism. You want me to be honest, don't you, Reverend Father?" "I do," replied Stephen. "And I don't want you to call me Reverend Father. You know my name and you know my nature. You called me the rationalist once because I insisted on reasoning everything out so thoroughly. You meant it as a condemnation. I took it as a compliment. Whichever it was an excellent analysis. I do like to reason things out and to reason them out thoroughly. So now let us see just what there is in what everybody knows about this place." "Ah, Stephen, the world is laughing at you." "I'm glad to furnish the world with amusement," said the abbot lightly. "I know another man who was laughed to scorn once. It was just after he had worked a miracle. Perhaps you remember?" "Come, Stephen, you spoke only a moment ago of the devil quoting scripture. You know better than I that no heresiarch of the centuries, no deluded fanatic from the days before Christ down to the present day has failed to do the same. Come, face the facts. Haven't you gone too far?" "I hope not, Peter, for I haven't yet gone as far as I intend to go. There are a few things that Robert and Alberic left for me to complete." "Robert!" snorted Peter, but then catching the fire that leapt in Stephen's eyes, he grew calmer. "A holy man in his own way, I suppose, but as steady as a weathercock. As for Alberic—" "Still speaking from what everybody knows, I notice," interrupted Stephen quickly. He would not trust himself to listen to anything against the silver lance he had loved so well. "Let us just face the facts, as you say, Peter, and let persons and personalities alone." Peter sat back in his chair and chuckled. This sudden change surprised Stephen. "What's so funny?" asked the abbot. "I am," answered Peter. "I haven't seen you in over 30 years, and yet we are not together 30 minutes when I have renewed the very argument we settled by going our separate ways 30 long years ago. Worse, I'm arguing on hearsay, as you so deftly pointed out. Forgive me, Stephen, but now I do rationalize the situation for me. I have been sorely puzzled for all of 30 years. Tell me truthfully, aren't you asking too much of human nature?" Stephen was pleased with the new tone the conversation had taken on. He loved to think, to reason, to argue, to discuss, to debate, but he detested wrangling. For a moment it had seemed that he must wrangle, but now that his friend had laughed at himself, the abbot could be freer. "I use your own criterion to answer that, Peter. Look at the facts. We've been here 12 years. Nobody has starved to death. Nobody has died from overwork or undernourishment, at least not to my knowledge," and the abbot smiled. "I have heard it said that Alberic practically starved to death." Stephen laughed aloud. "Did you ever see the man, Peter?" The monk shook his head. "Well, even the year he died, he looked like a warrior, and not like one who was weary after a long, hard campaign, but like one in the finest fighting trim, fresh for the battle. Ah, dumb rumor has a long, long tongue and a twisted one. No, Peter, that's absurd. Do I look starved?" "Not at all." "And neither do any of the brethren," went on Stephen. "Benedict's allotment of 2 cooked portions, 1 pound of bread, and 3/4 of a pint of wine will not only keep body and soul together, they will keep body and soul apart. The flesh won't lust so much against the spirit if it's not overfed." "But Stephen, this is surely more than God demands." "It all depends on what you mean, Peter," said Stephen quietly. "It is true that God does not demand that we do all that is being done here at Citeaux in order that we get to heaven. But for that matter, he doesn't demand all that you are doing at Cluny either. A command is one thing, a counsel another. But if you think that we are doing more than will please God, how do you translate this?" And Stephen held up a crucifix. When Peter did not answer immediately, Stephen nodded meaningfully and said, "He was left at too." The Cluniac only stirred uneasily, and Stephen went on. "There's our ultimate answer to every charge, Peter. I have heard most of them. I know we are considered fools. I know that some are saying that we have debased the meaning of the rule, the nature of man, and the dignity of the priesthood. I have heard the world laughing at what it terms our Pharisaism. But after the first sting to my natural sensitivity, it does not bother me, nor should it bother anyone who has read the gospel." "Oh, Stephen." The abbot leaned forward as if to emphasize his point. "Peter, the gospel contains the biography of a man who went about doing good. You know the reward he received for it. He was called wine-bibber, friend of publican and sinner. He was taunted with having a devil, decried as a violator of the law, and looked upon as mad by his own relatives. That is the man who said, 'Come, follow me.' And that is the man we are trying to follow." "And whom are we at Cluny following?" The question had come with so much fire that Stephen could not restrain his chuckle. "Let me explain," he said, and sat back. Peter stirred as if he would object, but Stephen hurried on. "The monastic world was getting soft, Peter, and it still is complacent. That is always a danger sign. History is a great teacher, and she shows that time always brings a very congenial smoothing and softening of what has come to seem harsh." Robert called these softeners mitigations. Alberic always insisted they were compromises. But whatever their name, the facts are there. With the years, there always comes a toning down of ideals, a dilution of the uncompromising dicta of the law. They are all the more deadly because they are so perfectly prudent and utterly reasonable. Course through the history of the Church, or even through the history of a single order of the Church, and you will find this thing which I have called the weathering process. The years round off the rough edges and soften the hard spots. Then there comes a check. It is offered by a man who is labeled a rebel because he revolts against prevailing custom. But Peter, actually, he is the only non-rebel of his age, for he accepts uncompromisingly the naked wording of the law without so much as a sneer for contemporary opinion. Such were your early abbots, Odo, Eimard, Mayul. Such was Hildebrand. Such was Benedict of Nursia, Benedict of Anian, and every other great reformer. Such, unconsciously, was Robert of Molem. I'm becoming more and more convinced that this is not so much the work of man or of men as it is of God. It is becoming my confirmed belief that Citeaux is not only a challenge to such places as Cluny, but it is actually a check to the weathering process that has softened the entire monastic world. I haven't found it soft, Stephen, and I've lived it 30 years. It is not as hard as what you are doing here, I admit, but I don't see where it is soft. I'm talking general principles now, Peter, with only a very few specific facts. I do not mean to censure anyone, but I must tell you that the effect of the life of any reform or reformer on contemporaries is that of a dash of cold ice water on a nicely warmed back. It shocks, it shakes complacency, it stirs them to anger. That almost sounds complacent, said Peter bluntly. Sorry, said Stephen with a smile. I only mean to read a little history to you and present some present-day facts. If you mean that being an instrument of God sounds complacent, I'll tell you a truth. It makes me as complacent as the power to consecrate bread and wine makes me complacent. I don't know how you feel, but I can tell you that I never feel so small, so utterly unworthy, so crushingly humiliated, as I do when I, Stephen Harding, a sinful man, hold God in my hands? Why, Peter, every time I reflect on the power God has given me, I blush as deep as my soul. No, my friend, to be conscious of being God's instrument does not make a rational man complacent. It makes him confused and deeply, deeply humble. Before another word was said, a bell tolled vigorously. The abbot arose, smiled, and said, "Come, that's for Vespers. Stand beside me in the choir, and for once sing the praises of the Lord while robed in the white of Citeaux." It was almost an hour later that they returned to the abbot's room. Peter's face was hard. In it there was a trace of sadness. As soon as Stephen had opened the door, the visiting monk said, "It is all too true what people have been saying about you and your church, Stephen. I'm hurt, deeply hurt. I had heard that you had denuded the house of God, stripped it naked. I couldn't believe it of one of your culture, refinement, ascetic, and spiritual sense, but it is true. That's not a church. That's a bare barn." There was an angry light in Peter's eyes. The abbot noticed it and wisely refrained from comment for a space. He arranged the chairs and seated himself after gesturing to his friend. "Christ had a stable," said Stephen. "That was once too often. Why do you repeat Bethlehem? Give him the best of the earth. Nothing is too good for God. Make your church magnificent just to show him you regret the stable cave and the coldness of the Bethlehemites. Oh, I'm hurt. No wonder the world is laughing at you, or rather sneering." Stephen scratched a piece of parchment with his stylus. It was the thoughtless action of a deeply thinking man. He realized that the world had summed up his action in a neat and very expressive phrase. He had stripped his church and stripped it naked. The windows were of unstained glass. There were no statues. There was but one candlestick in the sanctuary, and that was of iron. He knew that the contrast between Cluny and Citeaux must have shocked Peter. Cluny was magnificence itself. Gold, silver, and precious stones glittered in her floor, ceiling, and walls. The sanctuary was sumptuously rich and strikingly beautiful. Even its exterior was such a work of art that Stephen predicted it would be the admiration and desperation of all succeeding ages. But what he was especially thinking of now was the shock Peter would receive in the morning. Stephen had commanded that the sacred vessels of Citeaux should be of silver gilt, that the censer be of brass, and the vestments of wool or linen. He knew the vestments and vessels to which Peter was accustomed at Cluny. They were creations of supreme art, marvels of skill and delicate workmanship. Peter had been among them for over 30 years. On the morrow he would vest in linen or wool and carry a chalice of silver gilt to the altar. Stephen thought he had better prepare him for the shock, but before he could speak, the visiting monk had leaned forward, touched him on the knee, and said, "That horror of a crucifix! Oh, Stephen, I'm hurt." "I understood your reaction, Peter," said the abbot quietly, without lifting his eyes from the parchment he was scratching. "The bareness of our little church must shock one who has been used to the opposite all his life." "But why did you do it? Why not give God all the grandeur possible?" "There's a difference between grandeur and the grandiose, Peter." "I know there is. It's the same that exists between poverty and penury, between unadorned simplicity and crude nakedness, between good taste and gaudiness. But if I have to choose, I'll prefer the overdressed to the denuded. Did you ever look closely at a Grecian column, Peter?" "No," he answered shortly. "You'll not find it bare, though you will find it utterly unadorned. If you look closely, you'll find it chaste, simple, sublimely beautiful. And what is more, Peter, you'll find it solid enough to support substantial weight." What has a Grecian column to do with your bare church? Nothing and everything, replied Stephen slowly. You see, Peter, I was brought up with men who were somewhat given to symbolism. Robert found this in the lone star you see in the sky just after sunset or just before sunrise. There's a simplicity, a chasteness, a splendid beauty about that star, isn't there? Peter nodded, not knowing what else to do. Alberic was a warrior. It is not unaccountable, then, that he should take a naked saber and a long silver lance as his symbols. For myself, I have taken the Grecian column. When Stephen paused and looked as if he would say no more, Peter again blurted, Well, what's the point? What has all this symbolism to do with your church? And above all, what has all this talk about chaste beauty to do with that horror of a painted crucifix? I had heard that you removed the corpus and painted a garish figure on the wood, but even my imagination fell far short of what you have accomplished. That's a horror. Stephen sat up. He looked at Peter a long time before he asked, Have you ever tried to picture to yourself just how Christ must have looked as he hung on the cross that awful Friday afternoon? Calvary was hideous, Peter. Christ writhed in torture. His body had to be roped lest it tear itself from the wood as it twisted and turned in agony. And after watching men die, I know that when Jesus Christ breathed his last, he was not beautiful to look upon. I have our wooden crosses painted vividly, for I want our men to realize vividly that Jesus Christ was crucified. Peter was silent. Stephen saw that the argument had struck home, and so changed his tact. What did you think of the choir? Not exactly musical, said Peter with his usual honesty, but truly fervent. Your men do not sing too well, but they pray better than any choir I have ever heard. Their voices are not the best in France by any means, but there was heart and mind behind the words. They really prayed. They truly praised God. I was edified and inspired. So the barn-like appearance of the church did not detract from their fervor, did it? Doesn't that say anything to you, Peter? We are creatures of sense. We need externals. But we are not only sense creatures. I believe in ornament, but not in ornamentation, and certainly never in ostentation. Our church may be under-decorated, but such overbalance is necessary to bring the scales back even. Is that your prime purpose? Stephen thought a moment. Then very slowly he said, No, Peter. That is not my prime purpose. In all truth, that is not my purpose at all. I was not thinking of other churches when I stripped mine naked, as you say. I was thinking only of the rule. The rule, exploded Peter. That's all, Peter, the rule, the spirit of the rule. The very first sentence on the oratory of the monastery is a veritable volume. It says, Let the oratory be what its name signifies, and let nothing else be done and nothing else be kept there. To me that says two things very vigorously. It shouts, Be simple, be poor. That's why you find no ornamentation in our church. Simplicity and poverty demand that it be as unadorned as a Grecian column. Poverty will not allow for silver, gold, or precious stones. Simplicity will not allow for storied stained glass, nor for vessels or vestments that delight the connoisseur of art. It was the rule that moved me. Peter smiled. It strikes me as strange to hear anyone at Citeaux speak of the spirit of the rule. For over 10 years now, the world has been laughing at this place and calling you Pharisees, because you have been so taken up with the letter of the rule that you seem to ignore its spirit. Stephen joined him in a smile. I know it, he said, but the world has not yet caught the spirit of Citeaux. Then, leaning toward his friend, he continued, Peter, long before Citeaux was founded, long before Molem was founded, yes, even before Robert had been sent to Cologne, the ideal you now see nearing realization has been conceived. From the day the chaste evening star appealed to Robert as his symbol, poverty and simplicity have been the ideal toward which he and all his followers have worked. I am but doing what Robert and Alberic would have done had God given them time. There is nothing in the church now but what is chaste, simple, necessary, and poor. I know that Robert jolted the monastic world with his rigor for the rule. I know that Alberic, with his spirit of no compromise, shook the world. But despite what the world says or thinks, as long as the rule calls for simplicity and poverty, everything about Citeaux is going to be both simple and poor. We've gone back to the letter to catch the spirit. We are now almost all the way back. Almost? Questioned Peter with a laugh. It seems to me you're already further than back. You're quite a good way beyond. But Stephen, I must admit that this visit and this talk have opened my eyes. I see your ideal. You certainly are realizing it. I can't say that I sympathize with the ideal as yet, but I do say that the world has laughed too loud and too long. You are the same old rationalist, and you have very sound reasons for what appeared most irrational. Forgive me for my seeming censoriousness. But believe me when I tell you that this is like being in another world. You can't imagine how bare and cold this place seems after Cluny. When I make my next move, it will seem even barer and colder. Peter looked at his friend quizzically. Are you deliberately setting out to stagger the world, Stephen? What is your next move? If I read Benedict's rule aright, he wanted his monks to be cenobites. But at the same time, he wanted his monasteries to be solitude. Again, I am aiming at the spirit. Yes, and you are hinting at something I don't quite catch. Well, began Stephen, when Benedict expressly states that a monastery should contain within itself water, a mill, a bakehouse, a garden, and the various workshops, and then immediately adds, thus eliminating the necessity for the monks to go abroad, I hear him crying more than, monks stay in. I very distinctly hear him commanding, world stay out. In other words, Peter, the third star in the Cistercian firmament is solitude. Now you have the complete ideal of Citeaux: simplicity, poverty, and solitude. Go on, elucidate, commanded Peter, who was all attention. You visited monasteries, Peter. Didn't you find them little different from feudal castles? Weren't they noisy with the horses of knights, the carriages of nobles, and the bickerings of serfs? Some are, admitted Peter, but I failed to see even a remote danger of this swampland becoming feudal territory or this little monastery a castle. No, as long as poverty and simplicity hold forth, but its solitude can be destroyed. The Duke of Burgundy has been very good to us. Much to the chagrin of many a monk, laughed Peter. They say Hugh is just as friendly and as generous as was his father. And just as pious, admitted Stephen in a tone of voice that brought Peter's eyebrows up. Stephen smiled. You saw that mansion down the lane, the monk nodded. Odo built that for himself and his suite. He never missed a feast day. He'd come on the vigil and leave after vespers. His son has done the same. I'm going to put a ban on such visits. What? Shouted Peter as he rose partly out of his chair. Great heavens, man, where's your gratitude, your prudence, your respect for nobility, your zest for the honor of God, your... That's enough, cried Stephen laughingly as he held up a restraining hand. And that is mild to what the world will say. But Stephen, you're mad. What do you mean by such a thing? Without solitude, there is no real recollection. Without real recollection, there is no true prayer. Without true prayer, we are eggshells, empty eggshells. But the nobility come only on feast days, Stephen. Surely your community can stand that little distraction. You never met the Silver Lance, Peter, or you'd never talk that way. He had one cry, No compromise. But how dare you take the gifts and ban the giver? Odo built this monastery and maintained it for years. He was the real founder, Robert. Robert was only the monastic head. And now you ban his heir from the house his father built? You don't know all that Odo did for us, Peter, agreed Stephen. We were putting up a fight when he came along. He sent men and materials, and the monastery went up. That was only the beginning. He donated pasture lands and set herds grazing over them. He set up granges and staffed them with serfs. He presented us with choice vineyards and gave us the most skilled of his workmen to care for them. Why, over half of our lay brothers were the Duke's vassals. He loved this place as a mother loved an afflicted child. He lies out there buried among the brethren, for he really was their father. His son, Duke Hugh, has followed in his father's footsteps. He is our powerful protector and our very generous friend. And yet before the week is out, I'm going to tell him that he can no longer come with his retinue to celebrate feasts here. But why? Cried the excited Peter. This is the maddest thing I've ever heard. You're abolishing a privilege that is centuries old. You're insulting nobility. You are biting the hand that has fed you, Stephen. Stephen, what means this madness? The abbot's smile was a little grim as he answered, It means I'm completing the rebellion Robert began. It means I'm being rational enough to be as radical as was Alberic. It means that the purity of the rule, letter and spirit, will be the boast of Citeaux. Peter shook his head sadly. It means that you're going to bring the whole monastic world and the whole world of Burgundian nobility swarming around your head like angry hornets. No, no, Stephen, the rule does not call for this mad measure. Peter, said the abbot very seriously, you have outlined what I have already foreseen. The only one who will not be offended is the man you'd expect to be offended the most. I'm expecting Duke Hugh to understand. I could tell you a long story about the tiny germs of worldliness that creep into a monastic heart and gnaw away silently till its very substance is gone. But I won't. I could tell you the effect atmosphere, environment, weathering have on everything in creation, even the monastic heart. But I won't. I could tell you of the veritable army of distractions that come from a mere glimpse at the pomp, the parade, the color, and show inseparable from a duke and his escort, but I won't. I'm simply going to ask you to read that passage of the rule I quoted a while ago. Then ask yourself if St. Benedict is not shouting, Let there be complete separation from the world. Let there be strict cloister. But no women come. Ah, Peter, that's what I call being literal-minded. That's the purest of pure Pharisaism. Cloister does not mean women stay out. It means world stay out. And let me tell you, Citeaux is going to be cloistered. It's unnecessary, Stephen, was Peter's final comment. Totally unnecessary. You're going beyond the rigor of the rule. You're going against moderation, gratitude, reverence. Don't you really think many overstress moderation, Peter? Look, he said and held up the crucifix. Not much moderation there, is there? Although Christ could have redeemed the world with a drop of his precious blood, he drained himself. And yet there are Christians who will cry, Moderation! It has always struck me that they are most immoderate in their insistence on moderation. All your arguments end with Christ and the crucifix, I notice. Your eyesight is poor, Peter. They all begin there. Benedict said, Let nothing be preferred to the love of Christ. The monk was not impressed. He sat there shaking his head. Finally he looked up and asked, Have you counted the full cost, Stephen? To the last sou, cried the abbot, and I'm going to pay it. This move will cap the climax, interjected Peter. White habits, sparse diet, labor like serfs, letter of the rule, denuded church, and now the banning of nobility. You are certainly furnishing the world with a lot of surprise. You're complimenting the wrong man, Peter, smiled the abbot. Pay your tribute to Benedict of Nursia. I'm only following his rule. And what am I following? The abbot arose. That last bell we heard was a summons to the reading before night prayer. Sit beside me in your flowing white robes, and during your meditation tomorrow morning, answer your own question.